Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a time more confusing than your aunt's Facebook posts about astrology, Victorian England. No, we're not talking about the polite, tea-drinking version you see in costume dramas. We're talking about the Victorian era, where things were a bit darker, a little murkier. Some practices are so weird, you'd think they came from a forgotten episode of Black Mirror. But before we go deeper than a bathtub filled with questionable liquids, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Tell me what time it is where you're listening, because it's probably way too late, and we all know it's 2 a.m. somewhere. Now dim those lights, turn on a fan for that white noise, and get cozy, feet under the blanket, because we're about to step into some history that's about as relaxing as a pillow made of bricks. Have you ever wondered what Victorian England was really like? How did people spend their evenings, aside from holding their breath at the stench of their own hygiene? What were the dark, twisted secrets of those who wore corsets tighter than your bank account after a sale? Could you imagine trying to survive the heat, the rats, and the bizarre social codes without accidentally becoming the local laughingstock? Well, congratulations, my friend. You've just woken up in 1860, and it smells like something died in your neighbor's house. Good luck. Bathing. The true test of a person's relationship with water, soap, and their own body. But in Victorian England, it wasn't just a spa day. It was an endurance test. Imagine living in a time when the most advanced form of hygiene was a weekly wipe down with a rag and a bucket of lukewarm water. Not quite the luxury of hot showers and antibacterial soap we enjoy today. In fact, some Victorians believed that taking a bath was dangerous. You might catch a cold, or worse, your pores would open up and let the bad air in. Yes, you heard that right. Bathing was a health risk, not a healthy habit. So instead, people wore the same clothes day after day, probably didn't wash their hair for weeks, and lived in a world that smelled like a mix of old cabbage, coal dust, and questionable life choices. So how did they survive? Why did they insist on not washing? And what happened when they did get desperate and tried to scrub away their grime? Congratulations, you've just stepped into a Victorian home, and the air is thick with the scent of survival, stagnation, and sweat. Now let's take a moment to reflect. Can you imagine going days, maybe even weeks, without a bath? And I don't mean the kind of I didn't get a chance to shower days we all have when life gets busy. No, I mean weeks of walking around, knowing that your last bath was sometime in the distant past, perhaps in a different century. It's almost like living in a time before deodorant, except, wait, that's because you were living in a time before deodorant. People often didn't shower or bathe with any regularity, partly due to the belief that water could, quite literally, wash away their health. Yes, there was this strange and completely baffling theory that water, which everyone uses to survive, was something that could actually harm you. It's like using a fork to eat and then worrying that it might stab you in the eye. You see, the theory behind this peculiar anti-bathing stance was grounded in the idea of bad air, the stuffy, disease-ridden atmosphere that water was believed to bring in with it. Forget the fact that bad hygiene is more likely to give you a rash or a rash of diseases. Victorian logic ran on the belief that being clean opened your pores, making you more susceptible to the horrors lurking in the air. So they kept themselves mildly dirty on purpose, probably under the assumption that if the air didn't kill them, at least they could rely on their thick layer of grime to act as some sort of protective armor. But the whole time, they were living in a delicate balance of hopefully not too filthy. So, what did this mean for their social lives? Well, to put it bluntly, nobody wanted to be close to anybody. Friends, lovers, even family members, everyone kept their distance. Imagine trying to get a cuddle from your significant other, and the only thing they could smell was the equivalent of a moldy, wet rug. Not romantic. And God forbid anyone had a haircut. The mere thought of actually cutting or washing your hair was seen as something akin to inviting a plague into your life. Victorian hair was full of mysterious substances, probably grease, but who's counting? It's safe to say the term bedhead didn't even begin to cover the disaster that sat atop their heads after a week without so much as a rinse. But then, of course, there were the brave souls, the rebellious few who actually tried to bathe. This was where the real drama unfolded. Picture this. You've decided to bathe. Maybe you're tired of feeling like a walking human carpet, or perhaps you've finally given up on pretending that a wet cloth and a bit of cologne will do the trick. You fill up your tub, a tub that probably hasn't been cleaned since last year, and you climb in, not really sure if it's the water that's going to clean you or if it's the act of just trying something different. You're probably already sweaty just from the effort of hauling water from the well, so what's a few more layers of filth? Here's the kicker. Most Victorian homes had only one tub, and that tub was not just for bathing. It was shared by everyone in the house. Imagine this lovely scene. Dad, then Mom, then the kids, all using the same water. The bath water got progressively murkier, and by the time the youngest child got in, it probably looked like you were swimming in a pot of stew. It was almost as if bathing, which was supposed to be a rejuvenating experience, was just another way of testing your relationship with bodily fluids and family dynamics. Could you imagine a modern-day family surviving that? Oh, the horror. And yet, despite the constant grime and general disarray, Victorians somehow carried on, living their lives, stinking their lives, and laughing their lives, believing that this strange battle with hygiene was just a part of the grand Victorian experience. And you know what? Somehow they survived it. They lived long enough to give us the legacy of really bad hygiene advice, questionable medical treatments, and a collective trauma that we, at least, don't have to suffer through today. As you lie back now in your clean, temperature-controlled bed, sipping a cup of something hot, remember that you've got it good. You've got running water, indoor plumbing, and soap that smells like flowers. Because, as strange as it seems, in a world that was full of grime, the Victorians truly knew one thing. Survival was not about how clean you were. It was about how well you could breathe through the stink. Ah, yes, medicine in Victorian England, a time when the word doctor meant little more than a person who could make you worse. Forget your modern-day prescriptions and the convenience of Google searches for symptoms. Back in the 1800s, people were handed herbal concoctions, snake oils, and some questionable surgeries that had zero chance of making you better. We're talking about treatments like bloodletting, draining your blood to let out the bad humors, electric belts for muscle strength that never actually worked, and the miracle cures of opium for everything. You could cough, have a headache, or even just look sad, and bam, you'd be given something that might knock you out or just straight up kill you. But don't worry, it's probably not as bad as the alternatives, like having your teeth pulled without anesthesia, because pain is good for you. So as you roll up your sleeve for your next treatment, ask yourself, what's more terrifying? The illness itself, or the fact that you're trusting a man with a leather apron and a jar of leeches. Congratulations. You've just walked into the office of an expert from 1862, and you're about to take your first dose of something that may or may not be safe. The real kicker? Bloodletting. Imagine you've got a headache, or maybe you're a little tired. Instead of a nap or a glass of water, you're whisked off to the doctor, and bam, he starts draining blood from you. Why? Because they thought your body was full of bad humors, a fancy way of saying the stuff that's making you feel sick, and the best way to fix it was by making you lose a pint or two of your precious red liquid. Bloodletting wasn't reserved for just the severely ill. No, it was a treatment for almost anything. Feeling off? Bloodletting. Overheated? Oh, bloodletting. Slightly emotional? Bloodletting. You could walk into the office for a sore throat and leave a few pounds lighter, and not in a good way. If only the Victorians knew that dehydration and anemia were more likely to make you feel worse, they might have just given you a nice cup of tea instead. But that's not all. If you weren't bleeding out at the doctor's office, you were probably being electrocuted, in the name of health, of course. Picture this. A Victorian gentleman walks into a medical office, and before he can say doctor, he's strapped into a chair and handed a belt that, as the name suggests, runs on electricity. They claimed these belts would improve your health by stimulating your muscles, which ironically is probably the same way you feel after being shocked by your toaster when it pops. Only in this case, the only thing getting stimulated was the doctor's wallet. The idea was that these electric devices could strengthen you, cure your ailments, and maybe even give you a little extra muscle tone for that summer beach season. Too bad they didn't actually do any of that, but hey, at least they made a noise, so they must have worked, right? Now, if you were really unlucky and somehow did make it through the bloodletting and electric belt experience, you were still probably stuck with something worse. Opium. That's right. The solution to just about every problem, physical or emotional, was a nice, comforting dose of opium. Got a cough? Opium. Feeling anxious? Opium. Can't sleep? Opium. Even feeling a little sad? You guessed it. Opium. And don't forget, this stuff was basically everywhere, from pills to syrups to lozenges. People didn't hesitate to pop a little opium as a pick-me-up. It was the 19th century version of a stress ball, except it would knock you out and leave you wondering where you'd been for the past 3 hours. But no big deal, right? If the opium didn't kill you, the side effects of depending on opium just might. And if that wasn't enough, the medical world of Victorian England had a few other wild practices, like the infamous leeching. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure, leeching involved sticking literal blood-sucking creatures to your skin in the hopes that they'd suck out the bad stuff. Maybe you'd get lucky and they'd just feast on your blood for a bit before being gently removed. But in the worst case, you'd be stuck with leeches that were more interested in your circulation than your health. Either way, you could guarantee that your trip to the doctor would leave you a little less healthy than when you went in. All of this begs the question, how did people survive in a world where the doctors were more dangerous than the diseases? Somehow, through a series of baffling decisions, a lot of people did survive. Some, however, probably didn't. You have to admire the human spirit, though. Even when the solution to your problems was either bleeding, shocking, or drugging yourself into oblivion, the Victorians kept trying. So as you sit back, comfortable, warm, and healthy in your modern life, Maybe take a moment to be thankful that your doctor is more likely to offer you an antibiotic than a leech. Because while the Victorians were certainly innovative, they were also way off the mark. Let that sink in. You've survived a time where medical advice was more akin to an amateur science experiment than an actual treatment. You're still standing with your health intact, and your doctor doesn't carry a jar of leeches. And for that, you can probably give a silent, grateful prayer. Imagine trying to get dressed in the morning, but instead of throwing on a pair of sweatpants, you're putting on a full-body corset, layers of fabric that weigh more than a small child, and a top hat so tall it could double as a shelf. That's the fashion of Victorian England for you. For men, it was all about tight trousers and frock coats, and for women, the more layers, the better, because who needs mobility, right? This era was all about looking good, no matter how much pain or discomfort it caused. The problem was, these clothes didn't just look heavy, they were heavy. In fact, they could seriously mess with your posture, your breathing, and even your ability to sit without looking like you were being slowly suffocated. But despite all that, people still crammed themselves into these outfits like overstuffed sausages, walking around in them like it was a normal Tuesday. So how did they survive these fashions? What did they do when they had to visit the bathroom? Or, worse, attend an event in a corset so tight that breathing was a distant memory? Well, you've just found yourself in 1850, about to squeeze into a corset that would make even the strongest person cry. Enjoy. Let's start with the basics, the corset. Women of the Victorian era didn't just wear these as a fashion accessory. Oh no, these were like the full-body armor of the 19th century, except instead of protecting you from battle wounds, it protected your posture and your ribs from the crushing pressure of too many layers. Picture this, your waist, squeezed to the size of a modern-day soda can, while your lungs are left to struggle for air in what can only be described as a fabric vice. This wasn't just a gentle, soft embrace of fabric, it was a hardcore constriction that would make a boa constrictor look like a cuddly pet. And just when you think, okay, that's bad, but I'm sure it was just for special occasions, think again. These beauties were worn every day, for hours. Women didn't just have to squeeze into these things in the morning and take them off after a relaxing evening bath. Nope. They had to live their entire day in a tight, unyielding cage that was meant to reshape their bodies into an ideal hourglass figure. I mean, who doesn't love an hourglass shape, except for, the breathing part? But hold on, it wasn't just the corsets. Let's talk about those layers. Imagine trying to get dressed for the day and having to wrestle with not one, not two, but 4 or 5 layers of fabric, each designed to make you look taller, thinner, and more importantly, impossible to move. For women, the full ensemble included petticoats, crinolines, skirts, and sometimes even more petticoats, like an endless Russian doll of fabric. And all of this was topped off with a tight, corset-shaped contraption that kept everything cinched together, forcing a Victorian lady to walk around with all the grace of a top-heavy penguin. But here's the kicker. You'd think that all this excess fabric would keep you warm, right? Wrong. This fashion was all about impression, not comfort. The layers were designed to make you look chic and feminine, but they were a nightmare in hot weather. During those sweaty summer months, women must have been baking in those layers, walking around like mobile saunas, while men were just as bad off in their heavy wool frock coats. If you'd ever had the pleasure of wearing a thick winter coat for hours in the dead of summer, you can imagine how great this must have felt. Now let's talk about the men for a second. You'd think that, with all these over-the-top layers, the Victorian men would have had it easy, right? No corsets, no crinolines, nope. These guys had to squeeze into tight trousers and frock coats that gave them the appearance of walking broomsticks. The tighter the trousers, the more impressive the man. At least that's what they thought. But oh no, these trousers weren't just uncomfortable, they were painful. And let's not even talk about the top hats. These hats weren't your quaint little toppers. They were towering structures that could have doubled as a third-story apartment. Men wore these to not only signal their wealth, but also to make their heads look even bigger. There's a fine line between I'm a person of importance and I can't fit through doorways anymore. But of course, the fashion didn't stop at getting dressed in the morning. No. The Victorian era was all about the event. If you thought that getting into these outfits was a struggle, try attending a ball in one. The whole evening was a calculated performance of keeping your posture perfect, holding your breath just enough so you wouldn't pass out, and making sure not to trip over your own crinoline while pretending that you were, in fact, enjoying yourself. It was all about style that cost you your ability to move, to breathe, and to even sit down. If you had to go to the bathroom, oh, no problem. Just get a servant to help you with your 5 layers of clothes, and good luck trying to balance on the toilet. If you thought modern-day leggings were restrictive, then you clearly haven't had the pleasure of trying to pee in a Victorian outfit. It wasn't pretty, but hey, at least you looked fabulous. In the end, it's hard not to admire the dedication that went into Victorian fashion. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about suffering in style, and somehow they did it all. Despite the tight corsets, heavy fabrics, and back-breaking heels, the Victorians made it work. So the next time you slip into your comfy clothes and complain about the waistband on your jeans, just remember, you could be struggling to breathe in a multi-layered Victorian ensemble, and somehow they made it through without as much as a sigh. How's that for a fashion statement? Ah, yes, the more spicy aspects of Victorian life. While the outward-facing world of Victorian England was all about propriety, manners, and strict decorum, behind closed doors, it was a whole other story. If you thought the 1800s were all about silent, polite sex, think again. The Victorians were into some bizarre and kinky stuff. From the whole idea of scientific sex to outright strange practices like spanking, tight lacing, and strange fetishes that would make even the most adventurous person raise an eyebrow. But what drove them to these extremes? Was it the repression, the social pressure to always be proper, or just good old-fashioned curiosity? And what did it all look like behind the bedroom doors of Victorian society? You've just stumbled into a Victorian bedroom, complete with candles and questionable decisions. Buckle up. Let's start with the idea of scientific sex. Now don't get too excited, because while you may think that Victorian England was where the kink truly kicked off, it wasn't quite as glamorous as it sounds. The Victorians were obsessed with science in all things, and this included their extremely clinical approach to sex. Books like The Physiology of Marriage were popular during this time, offering advice on how to be a proper lover. Now imagine being told that the best way to satisfy your partner wasn't with romance or spontaneity, but through measured techniques, like you were following a recipe for a soup rather than exploring the realm of human intimacy. There was a lot of focus on performance, with sexual acts being dissected like an experiment. The Victorians were, ironically, highly scientific about sex, but no one was actually having fun. You'd think with all their focus on natural science, they'd at least have learned how to enjoy it. And then there was tight lacing, which wasn't just a fashion statement, it was also a thing in the bedroom. If you think wearing a corset during your daily life is uncomfortable, imagine wearing one during intimate moments. Victorian women would often tighten their corsets so severely that their ribs were pushed inwards, a practice which often led to serious health issues. But somehow, this extreme discomfort became associated with sexual allure. The more restrictive the corset, the more desirable the woman was perceived to be. It wasn't just about looking thin, it was about presenting oneself as a tightly wound package of feminine virtue. And if that's not a recipe for discomfort, I don't know what is. This, of course, bled into the bedroom as well, where women were sometimes expected to remain in their corsets during sex. Because nothing says passion like struggling to breathe and feeling like you might faint any second. Now, don't get too caught up in the idea of tightly laced, proper sex, because the Victorians were also into some other strange practices, like spanking. Yes, spanking. But before you imagine a typical 50 Shades scenario, let me remind you that this wasn't some consensual, playful romp. This was about punishment. In the Victorian mind, spanking and other forms of corporal punishment were often linked to sexual arousal. It was believed that physical pain could awaken passion, and let's be honest, the Victorians had a pretty weird relationship with authority and control. People didn't see sex as a mutual act of love. Instead, it was about dominance, submission, and finding strange, creative ways to discipline each other. And no, I'm not just talking about the occasional tap on the backside. We're talking about full-on corporal punishment, the kind that would make you question your life choices for even stepping foot in that bedroom. And if that wasn't weird enough, let's talk about fetishes. Victorian society, despite its focus on propriety, had its fair share of, let's call them, unusual desires. This period saw the rise of foot fetishes, leather, and other strange objects. It seems that when you repress things for long enough, they come out in weird, unexpected ways. There were even manuals written to help people navigate their alternative desires. These manuals were essentially self-help books, but instead of helping you with your career, they were helping you work through your bizarre sexual fantasies. You could imagine a Victorian gentleman leafing through a book on eroticism for tips on how to be more proper in his bedroom dealings, because if there's one thing the Victorians were good at, it was trying to make even the most depraved things seem normal. But despite all the strange sexual behaviors and fetishes, the Victorians weren't completely lost in their perversions. Some of them were genuinely trying to be good, moral people under the guidance of their society's proper standards. After all, many Victorians were still highly religious, and sex was seen as something that should be controlled. The repression of sexual desire became a cultural obsession. So what did they do when their desires didn't fit neatly into the box of moral righteousness? They found weird, creative ways to sneak them in through the back door, so to speak. And this secret life of sexual repression, guilt, and curiosity became a key part of the Victorian experience. Congratulations. You've now stepped into a Victorian bedroom where passion, guilt, and bizarre practices intertwine in ways that would make modern-day us cringe. But as strange and uncomfortable as it sounds, these were the norms, and somehow they survived them. So the next time you think your relationship is complex, just remember, at least you don't have to wear a corset during date night, and your partner probably isn't consulting a scientific manual on how to please you. Let's talk about food. Not just any food, but the glorious, stomach-turning meals that were served at the fancy dinner parties hosted by the elite. You'd think a dinner party would be a delightful evening with fine wine, rich meats, and decadent desserts. But in Victorian England, think again. You might start with an appetizer of jellied eels, followed by a main course of roast mutton that's been simmering in questionable spices for hours. Was it a delicacy? Or was it the last thing you ever wanted to eat before you accidentally joined the ranks of people who mysteriously died from food poisoning? Even the dessert wasn't safe. Candied fruits that were probably more about hiding the sour than anything else. Oh, and let's not forget the absence of refrigeration, which left everything in a state of perishability. So how did the Victorians survive these feasts without losing their stomachs and their lives? You've just arrived at a Victorian dinner table, and trust me, you might want to back out now. First, let's discuss the appetizers. Imagine walking into a Victorian dinner party, fancy attire and all, only to be greeted by a heaping dish of jellied eels. Now, before you wrinkle your nose and think, what kind of sick joke is this? Know that jellied eels were, in fact, a delicacy. Yes, you heard that right. A dish of slippery, gelatinous eels suspended in a rubbery cold broth was considered the height of refinement. If that doesn't make your stomach turn, I'm not sure what will. It wasn't just about eating the eels. It was about showing how elite you were by embracing the strangest, most off-putting foods possible. A rich, deep-sea flavor with a suspiciously gelatinous texture would have been just the thing to start off your evening of fine dining with the upper crust. And if you had the nerve to gag, well, darling, you might be branded as a commoner, unfit for this refined society. Forget about small talk. Everyone would be too busy watching your reaction to the eels. Next up, the main course. The roast mutton. This wasn't just any roast mutton. No. This was a giant, smelly hunk of sheep that had been slow cooked in a suspicious mix of spices, and if you were lucky, a dollop of grease. The thing is, mutton was cheap, and cheap meat needed a lot of seasoning to make it palatable. And with Victorian cooking methods, without the luxury of modern refrigeration or even an understanding of hygiene, this meat was likely teeming with bacteria. But hey, it was cooked for hours, so it was probably fine, right? Maybe you could mask the smell of decay with enough spices, but no amount of rosemary could make your stomach forget what you were actually eating. And, let's not forget the stewing. Mutton wasn't just roasted in the oven, it was often boiled down to a mushy consistency, leaving you with a stew of questionable texture and flavor. By the time it hit the dinner table, it was practically unrecognizable, but as a guest, you'd better pretend to enjoy it, because you were being treated to a privilege, not just any old meal, but the finest that Victorian high society had to offer. If you didn't appreciate it, you might not get invited to the next exclusive gathering of the elite. Then came dessert. Oh, the sweet, sweet dessert. You'd think after all that mutton and eel, they'd go easy on your digestive system, wouldn't you? Well, no. Desserts in Victorian times were just as misguided as the main courses. They were often overly sweet, overly complicated, and overly preserved. Candied fruits were particularly popular, but instead of fresh, ripe fruits, you got heavily sugared and preserved specimens that might have started as fruit, but ended up looking more like shriveled, sticky objects encased in sugar. Why? Because the Victorians loved the idea of preserving things, even if it meant sacrificing flavor. After all, its preservation was an art. The idea of fresh, light fruit that didn't have to be buried under sugar and syrup would have been utterly foreign. So imagine biting into a candied orange slice that might taste like it's been sitting around for a decade. Delicious, right? But you couldn't dare criticize the dessert. That would be as rude as turning your nose up at the jellied eels, and that, my friend, would get you kicked out of society faster than you can say high tea. And then, of course, there was the matter of food preservation, or rather, the lack of it. The Victorians didn't have fridges or freezers. No, they relied on methods like salting, pickling, and hope. Fresh produce was a luxury, and anything perishable had a limited lifespan. Imagine eating a piece of beef that had been hanging in a butcher's shop for a week, or a loaf of bread that was just shy of growing its own mold. It was a time when bacteria and germs had free rein, and food was often served on the edge of danger. And yet, the Victorians ate it all with a sense of pride, as if their food choices were the pinnacle of sophistication. So there you are, seated at the grand Victorian dinner table, looking at your plate of questionable mutton, gelatinous eels, and suspiciously sweet fruit. How did they do it? How did they survive these feasts without thinking, I'm probably going to regret this? The answer is simple. They had no choice. To turn down food at a dinner party wasn't just impolite. It was social suicide. You had to smile, chew, and pretend that you were enjoying every bite, even if your insides were screaming for mercy. But through some miracle of human stubbornness, they made it through these feasts, alive, if not entirely healthy. So the next time you sit down to a meal, maybe give a small nod to the Victorians. They survived the jellied eels, the questionable mutton, and the candied fruits that could have doubled as bricks, all while maintaining their proper decorum. And if nothing else, you'll feel a little better about whatever you're having for dinner tonight. When most of us think of entertainment today, we think of Netflix, video games, or maybe a nice dinner out with friends. But in Victorian England, if you wanted to be entertained, you had a few options. You could go watch a public execution, attend a freak show, or even pay to see some poor soul get burned alive in a ritualistic demonstration of justice. Because, as it turns out, the Victorians loved a bit of bloodshed with their afternoon tea. Picture this, people crowding around in excitement to watch a criminal being hanged in public. Were they horrified? Or did they just enjoy the drama of it all? Perhaps it was a bit of both. So if you think your modern-day Netflix drama is intense, wait till you experience the Victorian version. Congratulations, you've just walked into a Victorian public execution, and the crowd is more excited than you are. Enjoy the show. Now, public executions weren't just a random Tuesday afternoon affair. They were full-blown events. They weren't just about justice. They were entertainment with a heavy dose of spectacle. Imagine it. You're sitting in the crowd, maybe sipping a nice cup of tea, and there's a sense of almost giddy anticipation. Why? Because you were about to witness someone's last moments. And don't worry, this wasn't a quiet affair. This was as much about the drama as it was about the crime. The poor soul being executed had to put on a public display, often paraded around town in a cart, usually with their hands bound, and sometimes even dressed in their finest, because they were going out with flair. The crowd would cheer, shout, and sometimes even jeer, depending on the severity of the crime. You weren't just there to watch, you were there to participate in a community ritual that everyone in town knew about and talked about. And let's not forget the best part, the actual hanging, which was a public performance of its own. It was like a drama, but with real stakes. If you're lucky, they'd get it right and the person would actually die quickly. But there were plenty of botched executions where the criminal would hang there, twitching, gasping for air for what seemed like an eternity. But hey, that's just the unfortunate downside of watching people die for your amusement. But wait, it gets better. If public executions weren't your thing, you could always head over to the freak shows, another favorite pastime. These were the 19th century version of today's viral internet videos, except with way more live animals, deformities, and the occasional human with a medical condition that made them stand out. You might see a person with two heads. They'd probably be someone with a rare disease. But hey, to the Victorians, that was just entertainment. Then there were the wild men, poor souls with physical or mental disabilities who were paraded around in cages for the amusement of the wealthy. These shows were not just about gawking at the unusual. They were a display of class, of someone showing off their ability to pay to own another human being's misfortune. If you didn't pay for a ticket, you were nothing. But don't worry, there were no rules about exploiting someone for a profit. If anything, it was seen as sympathy, because if you pitied them enough, you might just spare a coin. But as the show went on, the line between pity and exploitation got blurry, and it wasn't just freak shows. If you were feeling particularly adventurous, or perhaps bloodthirsty, you could head to the next big event, the ritualistic demonstrations of justice. Sometimes, these involved public burnings. Yes, you heard that right, burnings. Executions weren't always as simple as hanging. Some criminals were deemed so heinous that they were punished by being burned at the stake. Of course, it wasn't just the fire that got your attention. The real entertainment came from the long, drawn-out moments of suffering that followed the verdict. It wasn't enough to simply execute someone quickly and cleanly. No. Tension was the key. For the crowd, it was a spectacle. They wanted to see the flames lick the condemned, to hear the crackle of burning flesh, to watch the struggle for life. And in some twisted way, they enjoyed the whole ritual of it. The Victorians, at least in this context, had a morbid sense of ceremony. A good public execution wasn't just about justice, it was about creating an experience, something that would linger in your mind, like a strange form of modern entertainment. But before you think that all this bloodshed was limited to criminals, don't forget that even the royalty had their hands in the business of spectacle. The Victorians were obsessed with drama, and they carried that obsession from the highest class down to the lowest. Executions, freak shows, and even grand displays of punishment were all part of an endless cycle of entertainment. You could be invited to a ball, but you might also end up watching a hanging right afterwards. It was all part of the same fabric of life, because the truth is, the Victorians loved to watch. They were addicted to seeing extremes. Whether it was witnessing the justice of a public execution or the horror of a freak show, the Victorian crowd craved the bizarre. They needed it to feel alive. So as you take in this strange world of Victorian entertainment, one thing is clear. It wasn't about simple fun or thrills. It was a time of heightened emotions, social pressures, and moral conflict. People weren't just watching for entertainment. They were watching to feel something, to be part of something bigger than themselves. And if that meant watching the suffering of others, then so be it. After all, it was all just part of the show. If you thought that health fads were a modern phenomenon, think again. The Victorians were pioneers in the world of weird wellness trends, from drinking mud for health benefits to wearing corsets designed to realign your spine. But perhaps one of the strangest health crazes was the health spas that promised to purify your body, though of course, the only thing they seemed to purify was your wallet. People would pay large sums of money to submerge themselves in questionable waters, believing that somehow this would make them healthier. Were these spas healing people, or were they just using good old-fashioned hocus pocus to part them from their cash? You've just checked into a Victorian health spa, and I've got some bad news. It's not as relaxing as you hoped. Now, the Victorians were all about health. They were convinced that the human body was a delicate machine, constantly in need of rejuvenation, and when they weren't busy trying to treat illness with an electric shock or a leech, they were embracing the latest miracle cure that was guaranteed to restore their vitality. So if you were a Victorian person of some means, chances are you were either drinking tonic water or visiting one of those health spas that promise to restore you to full health just by bathing in their supposedly magical waters. You see, these spas were advertised as places where the purest of waters would cleanse your body and soul. These weren't your run-of-the-mill pools. No, they were filled with special waters that had been sourced from the most obscure places, perhaps even from a spring that no one really knew anything about. But that didn't stop people from flocking to them in droves, paying ridiculous amounts of money to soak in these often suspiciously dirty-looking pools. The idea was simple. Submerge yourself in these magical waters, and it would wash away the toxins, refresh your body, and make you feel renewed. But of course, these spas weren't exactly the health retreats you'd imagine today. Instead of tranquil settings with smooth rocks and soft ambient music, the spas were packed with cold, murky water, dirty towels, and a sense that no one was really sure what was going on. They also offered a variety of treatments, all of which could be generously described as questionable. You could get massaged by an untrained therapist who likely had no idea how to properly relax you, unless their method involved slapping your back with what was probably a dead fish. The spa itself could have easily been a breeding ground for diseases, but the Victorians were convinced that these spa visits were the way to restore their health. Why? Because it sounded fancy, and if it was expensive, it had to be effective, right? But let's talk about the real Victorian miracle cure, mud. Yes, the Victorians were absolutely obsessed with the idea that mud could fix everything. Drinking mud, bathing in mud, even just smearing mud all over your face. This was the wellness craze of the time. Supposedly, it would draw out all the impurities from your body, though, if we're being honest, the only thing it really pulled out was your dignity. Why did they think this was a good idea? Well, apparently, some muddy spring somewhere in England had been touted as having magical healing properties. So of course, it caught on like wildfire. People didn't bat an eye at the thought of swallowing a mixture of mud and water, thinking it would clear their skin, improve their digestion, or maybe even extend their lifespan. No one had really figured out the long-term consequences. But hey, who could resist a cure-all that involved dirt? And then we have the grand champion of Victorian health fads, the corset. But this wasn't just any corset. It was marketed as an orthopedic miracle. You'd wear this tight-fitting, body-crushing device to correct your posture, realign your spine, and boost your health by squeezing you into the shape of an hourglass. The fact that corsets made it nearly impossible to breathe was merely a side effect of your new, improved posture. In fact, wearing a corset was like going to the gym without doing any of the work. You just have to squeeze yourself into an uncomfortably tight shape, and your body would supposedly reshape itself, no effort required. The Victorians were convinced that the key to perfect health lay in tight lacing, squeezing your body into a smaller space to somehow make it healthier, and if the corset didn't cure your issues, well, it probably just made them worse. But you'd be too thin to notice, right? And of course, when it came to health, the Victorians loved their tonics. These were magical potions, often made of herbs, roots, and who knows what else, that promised to fix everything. Feeling tired? Take a tonic. Got a headache? Tonic time. And of course, these tonics often contained alcohol, sometimes a lot of it, because the cure for all things in Victorian England seemed to be slightly stronger than water. The truth was, these tonics were more likely to make you tipsy than actually heal you. But hey, if it was good enough for the Victorians, it was good enough for anyone. The Victorians were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to feel better, even if it meant putting their health at risk. So the next time you feel the urge to buy into a health fad or try some new wellness trend, just remember, at least you're not drinking mud, wearing a corset so tight you can't breathe, or dropping big bucks on a health spa that's probably filled with bacteria. You've got it good, and maybe, just maybe, a nice walk in the park will be the cure, all you've been looking for. So as you lie back now, comfortably tucked into your modern bed, with your warm blankets and your clean sheets, take a moment to reflect on the sheer madness that was Victorian life. We've come a long way since those strange days of jellied eels, bloodletting, and mud baths. It's easy to look back and laugh at the bizarre health fads, the brutal entertainments, and the fashion choices that could suffocate a person faster than a bad decision on a first date. But in a strange way, those quirky, often horrific practices remind us of something important: resilience. Despite the confusion, the discomfort, and the downright dangerous decisions, people survived. They persevered through an age that seemed determined to make life as difficult as possible, yet they did it with a stiff upper lip and an even stiffer corset. As you lie here, perhaps a little more grateful for the hot water, the comfortable clothes, and the lack of leeches in your life, remember, the Victorians didn't have it easy, but they made it work. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors who managed to survive the Victorian era's weirdest trends. They dealt with the filth, the madness, and the strange obsessions, and now you get to sleep peacefully in a world where medicine doesn't involve electric belts, and you can bathe without worrying about bad air. Because despite all the absurdity, the chaos, and the downright creepy history, we've learned something. People are stubborn, resourceful, and often just a little ridiculous. And maybe that's what's gotten us this far, surviving no matter how strange, how uncomfortable, or how bizarre the world seems. Now rest easy, because you've survived a journey through a time when things were far weirder than anything you'll encounter tomorrow. Sweet dreams, my friend. You've earned them, okay? Good night.